Hello everyone, welcome back to Talking History. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you all keeping well. So last week's video was the War Without Love, and if you haven't seen that yet, I will link it somewhere for you to go and find and watch. But for this week, the sons are at it again. But this time they're at each other's throats instead of Daddy's, and poor old Daddy is stuck in the middle. So if you want to find out what they're up to now, you better stay tuned. King Henry II, now aged 41 years old, had won the war without love, or as Henry had described it, like an eagle pecked and destroyed by its own chicks. Henry had given his sons more money and titles, and he forbid them in asking for any more. Eleanor, she was kept under house arrest, first at Chinon Castle after the rebellion had ended. Then she was sent to Salisbury Castle, and she was kept under house arrest in several English palaces during Henry's reign. Eleanor was never trusted by Henry again, but Henry's cruelty to Eleanor was to keep her in exile from the Duchy of Aquitaine that she loved. During Henry and Eleanor's marriage, Henry never stayed faithful. Henry had kept many mistresses over the years, but none was like Rosamond Clifford, who became known as Fair Rosamond. It's possible that they first met in the 1160s. Some believe that their affair began when Eleanor was pregnant with their last child, who was John. There's very little known about Rosamond, at least until Henry had publicly acknowledged her as his mistress in 1174, although they had been lovers for a few years before his announcement. However, their relationship didn't last very long after Henry made the announcement. Their affair ended and Rosamond withdrew herself to Godstone Abbey, possibly because she was ill, and Rosamond died in 1176. Rosamond wasn't Henry's only mistress. Henry had several illegitimate children, including William Longsby and Geoffrey, Archbishop of York. Now, after Rosamond's death, Henry was rumoured to have moved on to the 16-year-old Alice. Alice was the daughter of King Louis, and she was in Henry's formal care. She was in Henry's court, as she was meant to be marrying Henry's son Richard. In 1178, Henry began to reorganise the royal council. So instead of hearing appeals for justice whenever he and his court went, as Henry travelled a lot during his many territories. So Henry had 5 members of the royal council appointed to remain at Westminster to hear those legal cases full time, this becoming England's Supreme Court, becoming known as the Court of King's Bench. Henry, he was beginning to transform England. In 1182, Henry, now aged 49, had begun thinking about passing over his many territories onto the next generation. But Henry's world would be turned upside down once again, and this time he would be truly heartbroken. Henry had turned 50 in 1183, and he began to feel the non-stop restlessness. His legs were bowed through the years spent in the saddle. Henry had been kicked in the thigh by a horse in 1174, and the injury had left a wound, and it was quite possible that he had a fractured femur and it had never healed properly, and he probably walked with a limp, and it was now affecting his health. And it slowed him down, but Henry, he still travelled across his lands, but now there were more frequent stops due to him becoming ill. On the 18th of September 1180, King Louis VII died, aged 60, after a long illness that had ended in several massive strokes. The year before, in 1179, King Louis's son, Philip, who was then 15, had been crowned as co-king. Philip now fully succeeded his father, becoming King Philip II. Philip was younger than all three of Henry's eldest sons. He now had to deal with a new king of France who was still a teenager. Henry's son and heir, Henry the Young King, or Henry Jr. as I like to call him, would have a relationship very similar to Philip, like his father had with Louis. The young king, Henry, was becoming obsessed in succeeding his father, although his practical skills at ruling were non-existent. And in February 1183, the young king turned 23. He had all of the titles. He was married to a French princess, but the young Henry had very little to no power, which he had hardly any military or political skills. The young king was still seen as arrogant and spoilt. He spent a lot of his time taking part in jousting tournaments. The old King Henry didn't like jousting. He found it far too dangerous, so he had it banned from being played in England. Now, jousting tournaments in the 12th century were much more different to those in the 14th and 15th centuries. In the 12th century, the jousting tournaments were much bigger, they were much more dangerous, and they were much more bloodier. And they mainly took place in France, particularly in Champagne, and they were mostly held by the new king, Philip II. The young Henry's tournament captain was William Marshall, who had been Henry's tutor, and William was quickly gaining a reputation as a brilliant knight. In 1182, during the summer, the young king had renewed his demands from his father. This time he wanted the Duchy of Normandy, but of course the old king refused. And once again, the young King Henry flew into a hissy fit, and just like he had in 1173, he went to He went to France and fully aligned himself with the French king, only this time it was Philip. The old Henry could only bring his son back by offering more money, and the young king was persuaded to join a family conference after Christmas. King Henry held the family meeting in Le Mans, and in attendance were all of Henry's sons, including Richard and Geoffrey, Henry's eldest daughter Matilda, and the Duke of Saxony were also there, as they had been expelled from the duchy. Henry had wanted his sons to keep to the original plan of succession. He had attempted to get his sons to give an solemn oath of their allegiance to him before asking both Richard and Geoffrey to pay homage to their older brother Henry, the young king, for their duchies of Aquitaine and Brittany. Richard refused. Richard has spent a lot of his time since the War Without Love in Aquitaine. He had been ironing out his military skills, and he had been removing rebellious lords, which, thanks to his older brother, had gotten harder. The young king had been making dangerous overtures to the barons of Aquitaine. He had claimed that he could offer much better lordship than his brother Richard. Henry had stirred up so much tension and rebellion. Richard had been fighting hard to bring Aquitaine under control. Now, for Richard, there was no love lost with his Fane brother. A huge argument erupted between the two brothers, and Richard walked out. He returned to Aquitaine. Henry, the young king, then aligned himself with his brother Geoffrey, who was described as being a hypocrite and a deceiver in everything. Together, the brothers prepared to attack Richard. Old Henry felt he needed to protect Richard and try to bring some kind of order back into the family. The young king's behaviour was disgusting. He'd negotiated in bad faith with his father. He got his servants to attack diplomatic envoys, and he had townspeople, churches and shrines robbed throughout Aquitaine in order to pay his mercenaries. Henry had also tried to raise the lords of Aquitaine into a revolt against Richard. Now, thankfully, Henry wasn't very successful with that one. King Henry and Richard had hired soldiers going from town to town, keeping as much control as they could. In early June, after attacking a church, the young King Henry was struck down with dysentery, and after a short and painful illness, the young king died on the 11th of June 1183. The young king had never seemed to want to grow up, but then he wasn't really given much opportunity to. But nevertheless, King Henry was heartbroken at the loss of his son and heir. Richard was now next in line, and in August 1183, Henry told Richard that he should pass over his Duchy of Aquitaine to his youngest brother John, as he now should become the heir to England, Normandy and Anjou. Richard refused. Aquitaine was his, and he wasn't prepared to just simply hand it over to his little brother. Now, by late 1184, Henry had finally realised that Richard wasn't going to budge, so he allowed Richard to return to Aquitaine. Henry had begun making preparations. He sent his youngest son, John, to Ireland. You'll hear all about that in a future video. And Henry had then suggested that Geoffrey get the young king's inheritance, thinking of bringing Brittany into the Plantagenet rule permanently. That way Richard could keep Aquitaine. Henry was trying to keep everyone happy. But Richard didn't want that either. So, Richard raised an army and attacked his brother's lands, as you do. So King Henry had had enough. He completely snapped. And he brought over from England the only person who had a better claim to Aquitaine than Richard, his mother, Queen Eleanor. Eleanor, she was still Henry's prisoner, but she was now back by his side. And King Henry demanded that Richard hand over Aquitaine back to his mother, which really meant he was handing it to Henry. Richard finally gave up and he handed the control of Aquitaine back to his mother, even though really it was his father. In July 1186, Geoffrey had formed a friendship with King Philip II. Geoffrey was in Paris for the summer when he was badly injured in a tournament. Geoffrey died on the 19th of July, possibly from his wound getting infected. Geoffrey was 28 years old. Geoffrey was buried in the Cathedral of Notre Dame, and it was reported that Philip was utterly broken over his friend's death. Henry had lost another son, and he was more troubled than ever before. He really believed that no one would ever be his equal to manage all of his territories. Henry began working with Philip II, who would become known as Philip Augustus, who was now 23, and their working relationship had always been from a distance, and things were beginning to boil up between the two. Philip had tried to take the Duchy of Brittany after Geoffrey's death, but Philip didn't have Henry's wealth or military experience. So Philip came up with other ways to outdo Henry. And in 1187, he took advantage of the cracks in Richard and Henry's relationship. When Richard visited Paris, Philip was gushing all over Richard. He gave him every compliment he could think of, and they were together every day. They did everything together. They ate off the same dishes. They even shared the same bed. Now it's from there where the question of Richard's sexuality had come from. But the truth was, it didn't have anything to do with a sexual relationship. It was a sign of a strong and political friendship that had been forged. Philip, though, he was playing on Richard's insecurities about being disinherited. Philip this is only a suggestion, that he may have actually suggested that his father was planning on having Alice marry John. After all, Alice had been engaged to Richard since 1161. She had been at Henry's court for 25 years. Whatever Philip was telling Richard, it worked. Richard had believed what Philip was telling him, and crusading had exploded across Europe once again. Richard, he longed to go on crusade. Richard's relationship with Henry had become even more distanced. In November 1188, war broke out between Henry and Philip, who'd been disputing over territories of Berry and Toulouse. During a peace conference, things got so bad, Henry and Philip almost came to blows. Richard, who was in attendance, had demanded that Henry reassured him that he was in line for the succession. Bearing in mind, not so long ago, Richard didn't want it. He wanted Aquitaine, and now he wants reassurance. Make your blemmin' mind up, Richard. So he wanted reassurance from his father, and Henry never said a word. So Richard said that he must believe what he has been told. So he knelt down before Philip and he paid homage for Aquitaine and Normandy. Old King Henry fell ill again in January 1189, and he was ill until Easter. While he was on his sickbed, Henry wrote to Richard, pleading with him to return with him, but Richard, he ignored his father's pleas. Instead, he helped Philip build border raids against his father. Henry recovered enough to attend a peace conference in early June. Philip was still whispering in Richard's ear, and immediately after the peace conference, both Richard and Philip launched a surprise attack on the castle of Lafferday. I hope that's pronounced right, along with other castles in the area. Richard and Philip were moving quickly. On the 12th of June, they attacked Henry's base at Le Mans. Le Mans wasn't prepared for the attack. The townspeople had set fires to the suburbs to hold off the invaders in an emergency measure, but there were strong winds and the fire was blown back onto the town, and quickly the whole of Le Mans was on fire. Henry and his men retreated to in Henry's weakened state. He and his men attempted a forced march north into Normandy, and it was during the march that Henry did something he had never done before. He gave up. Henry doubled back. He sent the rest of his men into Normandy. Henry returned to Anjou, travelling through his lands that were now completely overrun with Philip's men. Henry arrived at Chinon Castle, and by the time Henry had made it, he was completely drained. Henry was bedbound for the next few weeks, and each day he was getting worse. For the beginning of July, Maine was overrun. Tours had fallen to Philip, and Henry had found the strength to drag himself out of bed to meet Philip face to face near Tours on the 3rd of July. Philip had an endless list of demands. Some included for Henry to surrender and for his confirmation that Richard was his heir to all of his lands, and the old king had to be held upright in his horse. But Henry agreed to all of Philip's terms. Henry was now far too weak to ride back to Chinon. He was carried back by his servants, and once Henry was made comfortable, he sent for a list of all of his supporters that had now turned their allegiance to Richard. And the first name on that list was none other than Henry's favourite son, John. The shock and grief was simply too much for Henry, and he fell into his final bout of sickness. Henry began hallucinating, and he was raving, and during a short moment of clarity, Henry received Holy Communion. King Henry II died on the 6th of July 1189, aged 56. Henry's triumphantly busy life ended in misery. He had been betrayed by those he loved the most, and his hometown was a burning rubble, and he had been deeply humiliated by the French king, who was 30 years younger than him. Henry, though, he would be known throughout Europe and throughout history as Henry II, King of England, Duke of Aquitaine, Normandy, Count of Anjou, Maine and Touraine, and Lord of Ireland. Henry began a dynasty that would be shaped by his legacy for the next 300 years. that was something to be proud of. Now, Henry II, again, he could be a little bit like Henry VIII, a little bit like Marmite. I personally liked him. Yes, maybe he could have done better with his sons, but Henry liked control. And that was very obvious that he wouldn't give his control away to his sons. And I think that was his downfall, really, which was a shame. But I personally quite liked him. I actually thought he was a very good king. But that's my opinion. And let me know your thoughts. Let me know your thoughts on Henry II. And let me know if you have any future recommendations, because I have so many videos planned. There's so much. I can't wait. So if you like what you've been listening to, if you like what you're seeing, I ain't gonna get any better than this. What you see is what you get. But if you like it, please do hit that subscribe button, and don't forget to, as you're there, that little notification bell, make sure you hit that as well, because that lets you know when I've uploaded a video. And thank you so much for all your comments, and thank you to all the new subscribers. We are so close to 300 subscribers. This channel is building so nicely, and I cannot thank you enough. You are all blimmin' wonderful, and I just could hug you and hug you and hug you. Thank you so much. But in the meantime, look after yourselves, take care of yourselves, do something for you. Whatever it is, just do something for you and look after yourself. And remember, it's okay to not be okay. There you go. Right, I'm going. So do something for you today. Do some, whatever you're doing, just do it for you. And I'm going to stop on rambling because I am going. I'll see you next time.